Well, I wanted to make things as difficult for Liam as possible, so I'm glad he had that text to work through this week. A good discipline for any teenager, right? Please pray with me. May the words of my mouth and the meditations of all our hearts be acceptable in your sight, O God, our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. Well, you're back. It's great to see those of you who returned after last Sunday's sermon on the necessity of talking about sin. When you preach a sermon like that one, it's always nice to see that some people do return to want to hear more. I guess the cliffhanger at the close of the sermon actually worked. Now, for those of you who were not here, I preached about our very real aversion to talking about sin in liberal churches. And that certainly makes sense. No one likes to feel guilty. No one likes to feel bad about the things that they have done. It doesn't give us the warm, fuzzy feelings like love and acceptance do. Talking about sin is also something that tends to be bad for church growth. So many churches, particularly in those times like we find ourselves now in the decline of churches, avoid sin because they don't want to push people away. Then there's the reality that talk of sin can cause real harm. For those who are suffering from self-doubt or self-loathing, talk of sin can put them in a bad place. That certainly was true for me when I was coming out of the closet, but it's also true for so many others in a variety of circumstances. Also, there have been those who have been deeply wounded by talk of sin. Speaking about sin so often can reopen those wounds. And yet, in spite of the negative aspects of sin, I do believe that people of faith need to have ways to talk about moral issues, to talk about things like good and bad, good and evil. We need to be able to call out bad actors if we want to strive for a more just world. We need ways to discern good from bad in a theological context. Moreover, we all do things that we regret. We are not perfect people. How do we think through our faults in constructive ways that can lead us to greater healing and wholeness? These things are complex, and they demand complex thinking when we take life seriously, which is what churches should be doing, taking life as it's lived seriously. So how are we supposed to talk about sin? What makes sense in our contemporary context? What are we to do? Now, the classic way of viewing sin is sin as a transgression against the laws of God. Human beings are disobedient to what God wants. You have this image of God as the lawgiver, a stern father justifiably punishing his wayward children. But by the grace offered through the death of Jesus on the cross, we are made right before God. We are justified in the classic theological framework. Having been justified before God, we are then given the grace through the Holy Spirit to live more holy and obedient lives. That is the classic way of framing sin. But this traditional view has some obvious problems with it. First off, how do we know when we sin? What exactly is this law of God that we're violating? For Orthodox Jews, to sin is to violate one of the 613 mitzvot, or commandments, in the Torah. But even that framework, which seems clear at first blush, requires extensive interpretations. Orthodox rabbis, are constantly debating about what qualifies a violation of these 613 mitzvot. And for Protestant Christians, the nature of sin is even more ambiguous. What is a sin? What is the law? This has changed and evolved over time. For so long, it was viewed as a sin to have sex outside the bonds of marriage. But now, with people getting married around the age of 30, and with the availability of effective birth control, very few Christians view sex outside of marriage as a sin. This is particularly true for those who get remarried later in life. There are all sorts of reasons whether people should be married or not. Should sex be beholden to our changing views on marriage? Take another example. In the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus says very explicitly, "Give to whoever asks." So when we do not give money to a homeless person, are we committing a sin? There are good arguments on both sides of the issue. I could go on and on. What is a sin? What is disobedience to the laws of God? These things are actually ambiguous. Another problem with the classic Protestant view of sin is that it gives us a get-out-of-jail-free card. Once you've professed your faith in Jesus and therefore have been justified before God, the slate has been wiped clean. You're good. But is it really that easy? Does sin go away at that point? Are we perfect after justification? Non-Christians quite often critique Christians for what they view as hypocrisy. They dwell so much on the necessity of committing yourself to Christ, but what about the call to end poverty or to be more loving? No matter how you slice it, the classic conception of sin and forgiveness has issues. There are similar problems with the traditional Roman Catholic view. In the past, Roman Catholicism had a clear list of do's and don'ts. When you commit a sin, you go to a priest to receive absolution. The Catholic Church has, according to its own theology, a deposit of merit that the Pope, through his priests, can dispense to forgive sins. But that creates a framework of committing various sins, receiving forgiveness, and then carrying on committing those same sins. Not only does that cycle raise more than a few eyebrows, it can also foster feelings of intense guilt among devout Roman Catholics. Particularly before the Second Vatican Council in the 1960s, Catholic guilt was a hallmark of the faith. Is that really a framework that makes sense? This is where I get to introduce you to 3 alternative frameworks on sin. Woohoo! I'm excited. I don't know. New frameworks for sin. Are you ready? Now I'm warning you, this will get just a tad theological. The first of these frameworks is the existential framework. This framework sees sin as constitutive of what it means to be human. The most thorough explanation of this came from the pen of Paul Tillich. For his framework, Tillich relied heavily on our text this morning from the Apostle Paul in his letter to the Romans. If you notice, in this text, the Apostle Paul talks about sin in the singular. He does not elaborate on different various sins, plural, that we might commit. Instead, he sees sin as a state of being, a force. We are caught in the state of sin. The basic problem, according to both the Apostle Paul and Paul Tillich, is the fact that human beings are fundamentally divided within ourselves. In Romans, the Apostle Paul talks about how seeing the thing he wants to do, and yet he finds himself doing that which he does not want to do. Why? I'm sure we've all experienced this in some form or another. You set a goal of getting up early, saying your prayers, being efficient through the day, working out at the gym, eating healthily, being kind and compassionate to all whom you meet. And then, well, life happens. We decide to hit the snooze button on our alarms. We're up late, and so we skip our prayers. Your kids start complaining about something over breakfast and keep nagging you. Someone cuts you off in traffic and you get aggravated. We run into that one person at work who really annoys you and we can't quite keep it together. At the end of the day, we find ourselves too tired to work out and we reach for that bag of potato chips. Then, lying in bed, we're frustrated with ourselves. The problem is we have these wonderful intentions. We know what is best, what is right, and then we don't do it. This is just what Paul's talking about in Romans 7. Now, the examples I gave are relatively trivial, but they hold true for more serious things as well. People rarely intend to do things that we regret, yet we still do them. Why? Tillich says that we are fundamentally divided people. We have our essence, that within ourselves that wants to do the right thing, that really is, oh, this is the inner Jonathan, the one that wants to do the right thing. But our existential selves, how we live out our lives, how we experience things, gets in the way. The key issue here for Tillich is that separation between our essential selves and our existential selves. That is how Tillich defines sin in the singular. Sin is separation. We are separated from others. We have a hard time putting ourselves in the shoes of other people. Our spouse or significant other does something, and we react from our perspective rather than seeing theirs. Our kids do something that gets under our skin, and we can't see things how they do, but merely react. We have a hard time showing compassion to others at work or at church because of this inherent separation between ourselves and others. But we're also separated from ourselves. This is particularly true when anxiety comes into the picture. I know none of you know anything about that. We set various ambitions to get an A on a test or the next promotion, and that leads to anxiety as we work towards that goal. Our anxiety oftentimes leads us to act in ways that we don't like. Our desires lead us to act in ways we don't like. We also have very real limits on our bodies, and we oftentimes are not in touch with our bodies. This is classic, particularly in Western society, to not be in touch with your bodies and when your bodies are telling you. We push ourselves to exhaustion and don't exercise good self-care. And when you're exhausted, how can you show kindness and patience? Again, there's that separation within ourselves. But we're also separated from God. There are those times when I know you feel connected to God. After all, you're here in church. You've had those experiences. You feel at whole and at peace. And in those times, we act with grace and show our best selves. But so often we are separated from God. We don't feel God's presence. We feel stressed and overcome by our feelings, which are not of God. We get angry with those who hold different views. We don't listen when we should because we're distracted and not connected. We feel guilty for something we did, and that guilt drives us into a negative spiral. Do you see Tillich's point? The bad things we might do, our sins in the plural, are rooted in sin in the singular. Separation from others, from ourselves, from God. Sin is separation. Trauma causes separation. All sorts of things cause separation. We long for a way out of sin. We long to feel connected. So that is one framework. I hope you're taking notes. That's always great. When I was down in Houston, I could always tell the ex-evangelicals because they were taking notes furiously. You're allowed to do that here. So that is one framework, the existential framework, sin as separation. Now, a second framework sees sin as structural. This framework comes out of liberation theology, a branch of theology that arose in Latin America in the 1960s. Fundamental to liberation theology is the appreciation of sociology and other social sciences. As liberation theologians pondered the problem of sin, they noticed that people often do bad things because of the circumstances of their lives. For instance, people who are poor might steal food because they are hungry and have no other options. Should those people be to blame for that, or is the real culprit the poverty itself? Psychologists have noted that when people are raised in an environment of scarcity, they often have a difficult time making long-term plans. There's never enough of anything to make them feel secure, so when they get their next paycheck, for instance, they're much more likely to spend it rather than to save. Children growing up in environments of scarcity have a much more difficult time delaying gratification, even though the ability to delay gratification is one of the best indicators of success later in life. Take another example. There is this trope of, say, the angry black man, but when someone grows up in a racist environment full of microaggressions and all forms of discrimination, how can that not engender deep-seated anger? People who have not grown up in that environment, who have not felt those experiences, have a hard time understanding that. The sin in these circumstances is structural. It's poverty, it's racism, it's scarcity. But structural sin appears in other contexts as well. Let's say you're in a community like Wellesley. There are tremendous pressures in Wellesley to have your kids go to certain colleges. Those pressures drive both kids and parents in ways that lead to stress, anger, self-doubt, selfishness. There's an unspoken expectation in a place like Wellesley that all will go well at work. What happens when it doesn't? What happens when you lose your job and have to sell your house? These are normal occurrences, particularly in various economic cycles. But think of the stress and negative things that can incur, that can be internalized as a result of this. I remember when one of my aunt and uncle's good friends lost his job. He never told his wife and carried on as though everything was fine. They kept spending money they did not have. Eventually, this friend could not maintain the lie. Tragically, the man had to enter a psychiatric facility because he had a total nervous breakdown. The structural pressures to keep up with the Joneses are examples of sin. Think of ways in which gender is framed in a place like Wellesley. What are the different expectations that we place on boys versus girls, particularly those of you who have girls as daughters, or have daughters? How do these expectations play out? Think of the number of girls at Wellesley High School who suffer from eating disorders. There have been a number of articles that have come out recently talking about the unhappiness and stress of teenage girls in particular. And the issue is far more serious than it was even 10 or 15 years ago. Where does this come from? It comes from something in society that is causing evil. Structural sin appears everywhere in our culture. And you could easily make the argument that what lies behind the notion of sin in Paul's letter to the Romans is structural sin. There are those forces outside us that lead us to do bad things, and we internalize the hatred, the expectations, the harmful situations of society in such a way that they help determine our actions. Should we dwell constantly on various sins in the plural? Or should we seek out the root cause of sin in the singular, that force that leads us to act in ways that we regret? Once we can name structural sin, should we then not seek liberation from that? In addition to existential sin and structural sin, there's another helpful framework that I would call sin as a preconscious choice. Again, you're getting a lot of stuff today, but this requires some unpacking and has been most clearly articulated by process theologians. Now, some of you might be familiar with process theology, but I'm guessing that the concept is probably new for many of you. Let me explain. Process theology arose in the 20th century out of a new metaphysics. Don't worry, this will all make sense. Classical philosophy sees everything in terms of stable essences. A stone is a stone, a plant is a plant, a person is a stable essence. There are certain traits that make them what they are. I am Jonathan. The Jonathan of yesteryear is the same Jonathan as today. There are these stable essences. But in the early 20th century, beginning with Alfred North Whitehead, certain philosophers rejected the notion of stable essences and argued that everything is in process. Again, this is process theology. Everything is in process. A plant in one moment is in the process of becoming something new in the next. The person I am today is not the person I will be tomorrow. My experiences, the growth of my cells, what happens to me, the choices I make, all lead to someone who is slightly different with each passing day. Everything also interacts with everything else in a web of constant process. Even a stone changes over time with different pressure, the interaction with water, among other things. In this ongoing process of becoming, there are always a multiplicity of things that lead to the new. Any action that you take has countless different factors that contribute to that outcome. One question that arises in the process framework is where originality and creativity come from. If everything is merely dependent on the environment around it, then we would live in a deterministic world. But we don't live in that world. There are some things that contribute to the new, to creation, to originality. Process thinkers name that source of creativity, that force that fights against entropy, as God. God is present literally within everything at every moment. God is one of the factors in the ongoing process of life. God is always there, luring us to oneness, to creativity, to unity, to love. But since God is only one of the factors at play, we can and do say no to God all the time, usually without even thinking about it. And that, according to process thinkers, is the nature of sin. Sin, that which leads to disunity, anger, discord, wanton destruction, is ever present. While God is constantly luring us to the good in each moment, other factors lead us in other directions. So you might feel that nudge leading you to help someone else. That nudge within yourself to help someone else. And when you do that, you experience something, some deep assurance of the good, of love, of God. But we don't always listen to that nudge. Most of the time we don't even notice it because we don't make ourselves aware of it. Now, there's much to be said about process theology, and don't worry, there'll be plenty of other sermons and Christian education classes where we talk about it in depth. For our purposes today, the key is that God is present in everything at all times, yet consciously and unconsciously we turn away from God in the constant process of becoming that makes up each moment of life, and that is the root of sin. So here we have three very different frameworks to talk about sin constructively. We have existential sin, sin as separation. We have structural sin, all those things in society that can lead to bad conduct. We have a process theology way of viewing sin, sin as ignoring the lure of God in each moment of an ongoing process of life. Each of these frameworks has their pros and cons, but none of them focus on sins in the plural as we often think about them. None of them create lists of do's and don'ts that are somehow true at all times in all places. Yet they all give rational explanations for the existence of evil in a world where people, by and large, do not have bad intentions. And here's the really fun part, as if you haven't had enough fun already. Now that we have some frameworks to consider the nature of sin and evil, we have also laid the groundwork for charting a path away from sin. Each of these frameworks implies some way to goodness and love. This is amazing and fantastic. We are not stuck in sin with no way out. Don't you see how important it is to delve deeply into this, to think deeply on theology, how it can help us? Now all we need to do is just lay out a path to salvation, a path that involves, I'm telling you right now, God and Jesus and the church. Simple, right? But for that, you're going to have to wait for next week. If that's not an inducement to come to church, I don't know what is. So I'll see you back next week. And by the way, feel free to bring friends. And some of you might be grateful right now that these sermons are recorded. There is a lot here. So now you get to go back and watch it again during the week. What more could you want?